In this lesson, we're going to set up and configure a root application context. If we look at our XML file, we see that we have established a dispatcher servlet, and this will create a web application context. There is another type of application context referred to as the root application context. Within this context, we will declare all of our middle tier services, such as any data access services that we have, or other beans that handle our business logic. When we create this application context, it can actually be shared amongst multiple instances of a dispatcher servlet. For example, we could create another servlet and servlet mapping for a dispatcher servlet with a different name. And we could give it another URL pattern, and we could actually have two instances of the dispatcher servlet. And then what would sit above those dispatcher servlets in the hierarchy would be our root application context. We could configure something like Spring JPA support and have two dispatcher servlets that both share those beans that perform our data persistence via JPA. Let's talk a little bit about how to configure a root application context. It's pretty simple. The first thing we need to do is establish a listener within our web.xml file. And inside this listener, we need to specify a listener class. And the listener class we use is actually contained within the Spring framework. It's org.springframework.web.context loader listener. When we establish a listener, what this does is it listens in on the creation of our web application and the servlet context. When different phases of the lifecycle are hit for the application, when it's initializing or when it's being destroyed on the server, there are methods that are basically observer methods that get called and queue these listeners to these different events within the lifecycle of the application. One of those is when you create the application and you can kick off this observer method within the context loader listener, and it can build all of your application scoped objects or beans. It's a common way of establishing some objects that are application scoped, and that's what Spring has leveraged in this case. The context loader listener follows convention over configuration principles. Once you put this context loader listener in place, what Spring will do is look for an XML configuration file that is named application context.xml, and it will search for it within the webinf directory. We need to create that configuration file, so I'm going to head to our package explorer, and within the webinf directory, I'm going to open the new dialog by hitting Control-N, and then I'm going to create a Spring Bean configuration file. Now we need to provide a name for this bean, and the convention states that this bean should be named application context.xml. Just enter that name and hit finish. This new bean configuration file will be created. We can head back to our web.xml file and we'll save the file. Now, one thing that will happen is that if we were to declare beans within the application context.xml file, they would be available within our XML configuration files for our dispatcher servlets. So we could reference a bean within the dispatcher servlet.xml file that is declared within our application context.xml file. It doesn't work the other way around. You could not reference a bean in the dispatcher servlet.xml file within the application context.xml file. Let's head back to the package explorer, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to tone our logging down a little bit. So I'm just going to open log4j.properties, and I'm going to change this to info. Once that's changed, you can close that file. Now we'll run a demonstration. With this configuration file in place, I'm going to restore our editor to its original size, then restart our server, and we can inspect the logs once we have the server start up. Just click on your server in the bottom left-hand side of the screen, and you can hold Control, Alt, and then press R, and this will restart the server. And we'll go to our console now. We'll look for the application context.xml file. There we see that our console output says we're loading the XML bean definitions from the servlet context resource, and then it points to our configuration file, the application context.xml file. At this point, you may be asking, well, how can I customize that configuration? One of the things that I really like to do is explicitly define my configuration. Much like in the dispatcher servlet configuration, we can control where we look for that configuration file. What we can do is we can specify a context parameter using the context-param tag, and then we need to provide a param name, and this name is the same name that we use for the dispatcher servlet, so context config location. And then we need to provide the param value. So param-value is our tag, and within the body of this tag, we specify the location of our application context.xml file. For example, I'm going to move it into my Spring folder, and then specify that it's the application context.xml file. We changed the location in our configuration. Now I need to just adjust that within my Package Explorer. With this in place, we can run through another demonstration. We see that STS is already reloading our application, and we see within our console output that the servlet context resource was reloaded, and this time it is looking at the application context.xml file that is found within the WebInf Spring directory. I'm going to minimize our console. And in this lesson, we had an overview of the root application context, which is used to configure all of the beans that are outside the scope of the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet is performing all of the MVC configuration, and the root application context is performing all of the bean configuration for beans not involved with our MVC project. So these are things such as your data repositories, maybe there's some security mixed in there, all of the other Spring goodies that we can use.